Okay, everyone, we're going to make a start. I'll begin by saying welcome to Mary Jane, who you've put your name and country in the chat. It's great to have someone joining from South Africa. As I said in the beginning, please feel free to use the chat. I see hello, Sandra from San Diego, California. We have more and more an international audience coming. So my name is Stacey Alvarez. I am working with SAEDI Consulting Inc. And I'm very happy to be the host and the moderator here today. Thank you so much to everyone who is registered and everyone who is joining, who's joined so far. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Now, this Post-CSW70 webinar is entitled Rewiring Climate Systems, as you can see from our startup screen, Women Redesigning Governance and Finance Across Africa and the Caribbean. As I mentioned, my name is Stacey Alvarez de la Campa. I'll be your moderator for today. I work with SAEDI Consulting Inc. in the capacity as a legal and regulatory consultant. I'm also a climate justice advocate and a consultant, so I feel really privileged and really happy to be here and be part of this event. So we'll just have a little bit of housekeeping first of all. So I know that we have a slide there where we can just show some housekeeping items. So please, we will request that you remain muted unless you're asked to speak, or once you raise your hand and we ask you to speak. We're trying to monitor the chat as best we can. So as he said, there, use the chat or the raised hand feature to ask questions and share comments. That will be really helpful for us. And most of all, just please know this is a safe space. We want to ensure that, everyone is respectful and attentive to everyone else. So we really would like you to be sure to listen, be sure to make any comments you have in a way that's respectful and polite. This webinar is being recorded, so please be aware that if you do turn your camera on or if you unmute your mic, this is being recorded and we do upload our recordings to our YouTube channel. So with that in mind, I will begin. And I'd love for you to know what our agenda is. So please, you can feel free to share our agenda. Thanks so much to the team. So I will be giving a few introductory remarks and setting the context for this webinar this morning. Then we will go on to have some fantastic reflections on CSW70 and some on-the-ground observations from our wonderful team member, Ms. Firewoyni Solomon. She was there in person, and she's going to give us some real insights. It always helps to have someone who is there on the ground and who can give a perspective that is filtered through the lens of a lived reality. We will then have a fantastic moderated panel discussion. I'm happy to say we have all our speakers present. You can see we have Devon Baker, Aliness Mumba, Sasha, Jattansingh, and Pietari, Arikka. I will give a much more detailed introduction of our speakers when we get to that point in the program. We will then have the audience Q&A. So I will encourage you to, when you are putting your questions in the chat, feel free to say which speaker you're directing your question to, and that'll make it easier for her to monitor the questions. And then we'll have a wrap up and some closing reflections. So thank you all so much. So without any further ado, I'm going to go into my introductory remarks and just try to set some kind of context and set a scene for what is happening today. Before I actually go into that, I'd love to explain the acronym CSW. I know that we tend to think that we all know what these things mean, but I was a teacher in another life, so I always like to not take things for granted and just explain as much as I can. So the term CSW, or this acronym, refers to the Commission on the Status of Women, and it is seen as the principal global intergovernmental body exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality, the rights, and the empowerment of women. And this 70th gathering, which takes place every year, it took place from March 9th to 19th in the United Nations headquarters in New York. So with that in mind, as you can see, there's some time has passed between the event, and we deliberately wanted to have a post CSW webinar so we could have a chance to reflect and digest what happened at this event. So CSW, that intergovernmental body, is seen as instrumental in promoting women's and girls' rights, documenting the reality of lives throughout the world, and as it were, shaping some global standards on gender equality as well as the empowerment of women and girls. And the theme this year was ensuring and strengthening access to justice for all women and girls, including through the promotion of inclusive and equitable legal systems, eliminating discriminatory laws, policies, and practices, and addressing structural barriers. So we chose to look at this. We chose to look at this idea of access to justice through the theme and the lens of climate justice and the climate crisis, because this climate crisis is not merely environmental in nature. It is fundamentally a crisis of justice. It reflects and reinforces many historical inequalities, entrenched power imbalances, and unequal resource distribution across societies. So climate justice calls for those most affected by climate change to have meaningful influence over climate decision-making and equitable access to climate finance, resources, and reparative measures. And climate finance particular is the aspect that we're going to be digging into more at this webinar. However, it is clear through global climate responses and finance systems that there's still an amplification of structural inequalities that are rooted in colonial histories, patriarchal institutions, and a level of uneven economic development. So if we want to look at climate change, climate justice, and then by extension, climate finance, we have to confront not only the very tangible idea of greenhouse gas emissions, but the less tangible concepts of social, political, and economic systems that end up determining vulnerability, access, and power. Now, there are a lot of studies out there, and we can see that through some of our own lived experience, that women and girls are among those disproportionately affected by climate change. And there was a UN report by UN Women called Feminist Climate Justice, a Framework for Action, that highlighted that the issue of climate change may push up to 158 million more women and girls into poverty by 2050. And this kind of statistic really undermines the progress that we're trying to put into place for gender equality and sustainable development. And this pre-existing vulnerability, it's compounded by gendered roles and unequal access to resources, because women are often responsible for securing food, water, and energy for their households. And these are responsibilities that intensify under drought, flooding, and resource scarcity. And I will say that this cuts across many social realities and socioeconomic brackets. We do tend to have a bit of an outmoded idea about women being responsible for securing food and having the rather colonial trope of a woman walking with a basket on their head, getting water or getting food. The fact is that me, in a relatively a developing country, I have a vehicle. I, as a woman, am the one who would have to jump into my car or get on a bus and get to a market or a supermarket to buy food and secure food. So this is kind of a universal reality as a woman, whether we want to admit it or not, or whether it's something that's intentional or not. So these are some of the realities that are rarely accounted for in climate policy, planning, or budgetary allocations. So climate change acts as a threat and multiplier. It exacerbates existing inequalities, which are disproportionately affecting women, particularly those facing intersecting forms of marginalization based on gender, sexuality, race, disability, or socioeconomic status. So a crucial aspect to this kind of context that we're trying to put together is that despite being most affected, women remain underrepresented in climate governments and decision-making processes. And this includes national climate planning, international negotiations, climate finance allocation mechanisms. So there are structural barriers which further obscure women's ability to influence how climate resources are distributed and how adaptation and mitigation priorities are defined. In that light, feminist climate justice frameworks emphasize the need to integrate recognition, redistribution, representation, and reparation principles that seek to redress these structural inequalities. So that's the point of this event. That's one of the reasons that we want to have this event today. There's a need to tackle structural injustices. Okay, there's a need for there to be equitable action based on human rights. There has to be a rights-driven impetus at the heart of climate justice. There has to be inclusive governance, not just technical solutions. And that's something that's very important. And we feel the timing of this event is of particular significance. There's quite an unstable and almost surreal geopolitical atmosphere at the moment. And this surreal atmosphere is unfortunately having a very real effect in major climate forums. And we have to be aware that this could well exacerbate. And we've seen the impact it's having on already marginalized populations across who are impacted by conflict. So the core objectives of this event that we're putting forward today, we want to highlight structural connections between gender inequality and climate change and climate governance. We're going to be reflecting on some of the insights emerging from CSW70 and exploring their relevance. We want to showcase, diverse examples of women's leadership and also feminist perspectives, which are not just being put forward by women. We would like to emphasize that a feminist perspective does not mean that it's something exclusively to women. A feminist perspective seeks to integrate voices and to show that we need to listen to everyone. And we want to identify some practical pathways for advancing gender-responsive climate governance. So through all of that, as I mentioned in our agenda, we will soon be, after I've concluded these introductory remarks, we will be having an intervention from our very own, affectionately referred to as Frita, Ms. Firewoyni, and we will be hearing some of the things that took place at CSW70. So I would like to move on to that segment of our program without further ado, and I would like to welcome Ms. Firewoyni Solomon to give her intervention. The floor is now yours. Just have to make sure that you're there. Is everything in place in your end? Hi, Lou. We see you
Yes.
now.
Hi, Stacey.
Hi.
Uh, Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from whichever part of the world you might be attending this event. And I'm quite happy and privileged to be sharing my experience at the CSW with you. Well, this year, like I say, I've had the privilege to attend the CSW70, which is one of the few global space where people from across the world, like from government, like civil society, organizations, researchers, activists, practitioners, they all come together to talk about like gender equality, women's rights, and justice. And the priority theme, as Stacey mentioned, was ensuring and strengthening access to justice for all women and girls, including by promoting inclusive and equitable legal system, eliminating like discriminatory laws, policies, and practices, and also like addressing structural barriers to like gender equality and women rights. So I feel like what makes it powerful is not just about the conversation themselves, but also like the connection that happens within like the events and the ideas that are shared and the collective energy that reminds us that our work is like global. And for me, it was a kind of like a space where like to learn, reflect, and also at the same time like equally like reality checking, I would say, because it shows like how far we have come in our activism and in our work in the spaces with gender equality, but also at the same time like it was clear that how fragile like the progress can be. And while I can say like while a lot of like international policies from like mid 90 something like like made some offered some hope for progress toward gender equality, like recent developments like conflict, like pandemics, or like climate change, and in general like what's happening like currently in a world, like I would put it like in a way that a more insecure world. It kind of like cast doubt to like the hopes that we gained from like this progress. So I think the conference by itself, like it served as a reminder that although like we've made progress, it shouldn't be mistaken for success. And I think that was one of the quote that has been referred to throughout like many events we have attended. Yes, like we've made progress, but it's not like necessarily a success, and we still have like a long way to go before achieving our goal. And I think especially like right now, critically where we are at is like we found ourselves in a time where like backlash against gender justice is stronger than ever. And I think one of the biggest realization was for me is like we are no longer in a time where progress on gender equality is like moving forward steadily. It's instead like we're at the moment where like progress is being challenged and it's being slowed down, and sometimes like there is even harder push backward to the progress we've made. So across many sessions and many side events that I've attended throughout the time, there was a strong recognition that gender equality is facing what we call like backlash, right? So backlash also is not always loud. It's not always loud, or it's not always like obvious. Sometimes it looks like kind of maybe delaying decisions, maybe like removing stronger language from policies when it comes to like when how we address gender, how we talk about gender equality. Also, it questions like rights that are already agreed on, that have been agreed on, like the movements worked so hard like to get where we are now, and we're at the stage where like this language and like rights have been questioned. And also it's kind of like quietly weakening the system that are meant to protect like the most vulnerable group. So backlash is like in a way how I saw it like being discussed, or the nuance behind that like throughout the events were like it's not always about stopping the progress completely. Sometimes it's about like a slowing down just enough so that the changes become harder to achieve, or like the goals become like harder to achieve. And then it makes it difficult to see, and also like it makes it difficult to respond. So one of the key things that has been discussed was we need to start from like understanding the backlash, because that's an important question to ask. Like, do we really understand like what we're responding to? Because backlashes, they're not random. Because however, like we've seen like throughout the events and like throughout the discussion and in general, like in general, the bigger picture of like the CSW event was like backlashes are organized, they are funded, and they are strategic. So if we don't understand like who's driving it, like how is it happening, or where is it happening, then our response to backlash may not be effective. So one of the key lessons like I would say for me is like we need to spend more time in understanding like backlash and not just like reacting to it. So we need to start asking like the important question, like where is the progress being blocked, like how is it being blocked, and what can we learn from this? Because if we can't learn from like once we understand the pattern, and history also plays an important role in this, like studying like the previous pattern and what happened, how it happened, why it happened, and then like who benefited from like what happened, all these things, and who was left behind, all these things. And we need to understand the pattern so that we can respond more strategically, and while being in the like in the process of like understanding what's happening. And the other thing that I've seen was like dialogues needs to happen more, like intergenerational dialogues, and like not parallel like conversation, because one of the things that I've seen in the CSW is like the events are like happening parallelly. For example, like the grassroots organization will have like an event by themselves, or like the main event will happen with the government delegates or ministries or like UN organization or the funding agencies. Like these conversations are happening parallelly, and it's not like the dialogue is not happening in the same room. So I would have loved to see more of that, because one of like how I felt about this was like there are many events happening at the same time. Yes, it kind of like creates a richness to the conversation, but at the same time, like it creates fragmentation. So many people are having important conversation, but it's like in separate spaces. So I think one of the event that I've attended, which like kind of like an eye opening and then made me realize that, oh, we need more of this conversation. It was organized by ideas, and it talks about like understanding backlash and from a perspective of like global south. And there was funders, there was a representative from government, there was academicians, there was, and they're not just present, they were just having the dialogue within themselves. So it kind of like allow us to see the missing elements, because when you have a discussion to like one segment of like the stakeholder, you usually can't see like what's missing, like the missing puzzles to the general picture. So that was what I've seen. And we are facing a global challenge, so we cannot afford to work alone. We need to have more honest conversation. We need to have more shared spaces. We need to have like more collaboration across different groups. And the other important discussion was like policy, because like these movements, wow, one way or another, if the people sit in the, like if they have power and if they sit in a decision making role, they will ultimately like influence policies, and policies like actually like influence our daily life. So the one of the other, like one of the key takeaway from the CSW was around policy, because when we think about policy, we usually think about technical documents. Yes, that is technical, policies are technical documents, but at the same time, like policies are shaped by people. So people, like when they come into spaces, they come with different interests, like different priorities and different level of power. So it's amazing to see like where you think like, oh, this is a global for a global conference, one of the largest conference, where like people across the world, they work like to a gender, like championing for gender equality comes to a space, and you would be amazed to see like this at the same time there are people with like anti-rights movements like strategically and like coming into the spaces like to challenge. So like I say, like people like different interests, different priorities, and different level of power. So when policies are being developed, like there are many voices that are influencing it, and we usually don't have the privilege to see the invisible strings. So when like if the many voices are coming to one place to influence policy, voices are not like heard equally. Sometimes some voices are very loud, some voices are very quiet, and some voices are like usually missing altogether from the spaces. So that's why it's important, like when we set the agenda, when we talk about policy, when we like have the document, when we implement it, it's also important to think like we need to have like we need to like see it from the intersectional perspective of it, and we need to bring people who have like multiple like identities, like different identities, so that like their voice can be heard and their voice like can be incorporated in the policy document that we are producing. So the other thing also like the one of the other thing that has been discussed at the CSW, which I find like fascinating, was like also evidence and how we use like evidence, like data, stories, and examples to shape like policies and like outcome of policies. But usually when, like for example, when the backlash like happens, it takes time like to collect, to understand like the pattern, to collect the evidence, and to kind of actually be at the stage where we can use these evidences to influence decision making. So what in one of these events, they were collecting like data way before the backlash was this strong. So they come up with like a kind of different ways, strategies, like how to different perspective from like different global south countries, and then how to fight against like these backlashes when they happen. So it's important like to kind of like keep pushing for more evidence to be generated in the space that we're working, because every stories and every data and every examples will matter and will be in a position like to affect this like decision. So the other thing also like the other key point that was raised during this events were like the importance of like collective actions, and how we need to like be very clear that like there's no single group like that can address these challenges alone. So we need to kind of like bring together grassroots organization, faith-based organization, civil society, like donors and private sectors to kind of like champion for gender equality and like to move forward and to kind of like keep the progress what we have done so far, because each different like because of like all of these groups like can play a role, and a kind of like we need to ensure that the voice of like most affected, especially like women and like people with disability and like who have like intersectional identities and like double burden, so that they can be heard. And I think the other thing, like apart from backlashes, the other thing that I've seen, and it was kind of like hard to notice, that um how it was a like kind of like a strategically organized pushback towards sexual reproductive health right of like women, and a kind of like a linkage and question being asked where they like there was not like necessary or like not about sexual reproductive health right, or like I would say like right for abortion and like all these things, and then they were used to kind of I don't know how to say it like more in a politically correct way, like to kind of like, bring a reaction out of like the people in the space. And it was a bit sad to see, but also it's a kind of a realization like, yeah, this is also a part of like the backlash. Like the backlash also included, like, that's what, like, yeah, we're trying to open the door, but the other side of it is like pushing so hard, like to close the door. So it's kind of like CSW, like being at the CSW and then like kind of noticing that as it happened was a bit of like an eye opener, an eye opening scenario, because like I say, like even in the spaces as big as this, people come with like different interests, different different level of power, different interest and different priorities. And sometimes there's not like it kind of like like makes you feel like there's no progress has been made. And it like one of the things that my professor mentioned, like because we were asking, yes, we were hearing about this like backlashes and this and that, but like, what is the way forward? So it was like she said something along the line about like 40s, like destabilize, like debunk and create discomfort wherever you go. Like if someone comes with false information, like, and then you have to like fight and like make them uncomfortable in a spaces where they think that they can like take away your right. So there was no um kind of like, okay, yeah, if this happened, like do this, if this happened, do this. But it was like very important to kind of like, you can't always like in a spaces like this, what I've realized is you can't always live with an answer, right? But you will be more critical about the question that you ask, and you will see like a different elements of like what makes the puzzle, a different elements of it. And like it's actually like um a very like kind of like I still feel like spaces like CSW night like needs to be there, and we need to use the spaces like CSW to actively push back against like the anti-right movements. So I think like I don't know if I extended my time. Stacey, like feel free to stop me.
It's
But yeah,
wonderful. We don't want to stop you because your insights are just so hard-hitting, and I can see from the comments in the chat that we really appreciate your intervention, Rita. Really, really, we do. I think that what I will do is if you want to say any last couple of points before I'll try to sum up what you said as well.
yeah, I think my conclusion would be like it's kind of like the attending the CSW70 was more like I think both it was inspiring and also like challenging at the same time.
Mm,
So it's a reminder that like progress is still possible, but
mhm.
it's not like guaranteed.
Yeah.
So, and it requires effort, it requires a strategy, and I feel like it requires collaboration. So that was like what I kind of like, I think in general, like would love to say in conclusion. But thank you so much for giving me the space to speak my experience.
Anytime. Thank you for sharing that experience in a way that was so eloquent and so at the same time really intuitively easy to understand. Like I felt the points you were making. I didn't just understand them because I think some of the things that came through to me very much was this idea, this very nice distinction between progress and success. The idea it's very easy to think that because we're included in a room that, oh, we've made it and now we're successful. But the fact is that that inclusion is only a first step. And I think you particularly pointed to that when you said, yes, everybody's voices are might be in a space, but some voices are louder than others. So we have to recognize there is a need to amplify voices. Presence is not enough. There must be amplification. I also thought too, an excellent point you made, having attended a CSW event myself, was this idea of the parallel events, which not only makes you think that you're missing out on so much, but it creates these levels of fragmentation. And also within yourself, just from a mindful point of view, there are often many events happening at the same time that you yourself have an intersectional interest in. Because of someone of Indigenous heritage, intersectionality is quite normal for me. Nothing is ever just in one box or can tick only one box. I see everything as intersections. So I found that that very false dichotomy was challenging to deal with. But on a practical policy level, you end up with conversations being had that can only be useful to a certain point because not everyone is included. And another fantastic point that we have to be aware of is the subtlety of backlash. We tend to think that backlash is something that's very loud and obvious, but as you say, it was very insidious, it was very strategic. But the most important word that I thought was it is funded. There is funded strategic backlash to the advancement of gender equality and gender equity. And I thought that your summary of what you experienced, it really puts things in an interesting light. And it makes us realize that I loved also the term you used, invisible strings. It makes us realize that in the background that we can't see, there are these invisible points and invisible influences that are coming through in policies that will push back against progress that we need to make. I also thought it's very important for us to remember from the points that you made was the idea of collective action. And it has to be collective action and again, intersectional action between faith-based organizations, as you mentioned, CSOs, as well as even the public sector. We have to amplify the voices of those who have intersectional identities. So thank you so much, Rita. We love that. And if the audience has any questions or any comments, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the Q&A section. So thank you so much. So we'll
Thank
be
you.
moving on. We'll be moving on to our panel discussion that we will be having now, our next agenda item. And this is our moderated panel discussion. This discussion features a diverse and multi-regional group of panelists. And I think that's something that really sets us apart and will make this a rich discussion. So for this segment, just to give you some guidelines, each panelist is going to be asked 2 questions that are relevant to their specific area of expertise. And they're going to address audience questions at the end of the session. So therefore, when you do pose your question, when you put it in the chat, please, if you can, let us know which panelist you are addressing your question to, and this is going to facilitate a comprehensive and relevant answer. So our first topic for this webinar is community-led climate adaptation. Now, I know our panelist, Yvonne, had been having some issues with joining. I'm gonna check. He was kind of dropping on and off. So what I will do, I will jump to our next panelist and presenter that I had in the queue, who is going to be focusing on the topic of, let me see, of feminist climate justice, gender responsive climate governance, and inclusive climate finance. And this is our panelist, Aliness Mumba. As an introduction, I would like to let you all know that Aliness is an accomplished development practitioner with over 15 years of experience in project management and business development across Zambia and the African continent. Her career reflects a deep commitment to social impact, policy innovation, and sustainable development. A key focus of her work lies at the intersection of gender inclusion and climate-smart agriculture, where she champions the equitable participation of women and marginalized groups in agricultural transformation. She brings a unique blend of technical expertise, strategic foresight, and inclusive leadership to complex assignments, and this has earned her a reputation as a trusted advisor to development partners and local institutions. Aliness has also led the implementation of some high-impact initiatives in thematic areas such as agriculture, climate change adaptation, trade facilitation, and governance. She has successfully delivered projects funded by leading development agencies and donors, including the European Union, Danida, and UNICEF, as well as Save the Children Sweden. Her core strengths include institutional capacity strengthening, gender-responsive policy development, program implementation, knowledge management, and results-based management. She holds a master's degree in gender studies and degrees in sociology from the University of Pretoria and the University of Zambia. So we would like to say welcome, Aliness. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this morning, evening, or afternoon, depending on which part of the world we are. Thank you so much for joining us. It's fantastic to have you here.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Again, it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this great conversation. And yeah, I'm really, really excited because our work sits at the intersection of climate justice, economic inclusion, and gender equality. And we have a strong focus on women and young people as key drivers of change. And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of systemic gaps that persist. Not because solutions are lacking, but because really those closest to the challenges are still not adequately engaged in processes around decision making, and they're not resourced or positioned to lead. So I am excited to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. It's great to hear from you. So we'll dive right in with the first question that I have for you, which is looking at equitable climate finance vehicles. How can these climate finance vehicles contribute to climate justice?
Thank you for that question. And in reflecting around it, I mean, for us at the Trust, we really believe that there's a great opportunity for us to sort of leverage and push for equitable climate finance vehicles, because these can be critical in that they can help to address one of the biggest barriers to climate justice, especially when it comes to the question around who has access to resources and who gets to decide how these resources are used. So when you think about it, in many cases, right, funding doesn't always reach the communities that are most affected by climate shocks. What gets to them is usually a fraction, and we see that then the vulnerability tends to sort of deepen for groups such as women and young people. So we believe that equitable finance mechanisms must have a level of intentionality around them, and they must be designed with an intentional dimension to direct resources to grassroots and locally led organizations and actors who are at the forefront of where climate shocks are experienced the most. And for us, as an intermediary, we see our role not just as an organization that is there to move resources, but rather as an organization that's there to contribute to shaping how resources flow, by reducing barriers and by supporting grassroots partners to access funding and ensuring that climate resources and finances can reach women and young people in meaningful ways. And being an organization that is grounded in a feminist perspective, our approach really tries to sort of prioritize those who are most excluded and bear the brunt of climate shocks. So in practice, for us, we strive to be flexible in how we approach grant making. We seek to provide flexible, accessible financings, particularly to smaller and community-based actors and movements. We also recognize and support the informal and care economy actors. So where women are more active around the care economy, because we see that as an added layer of a burden within the context of changing climate and climate shocks. So women who would ordinarily bear the care duties of around being able to address energy issues, so collecting firewood, collecting water, that care burden falls to them, and that's exacerbated when climate shocks such as drought take place. So we try to prioritize actors in that informal economy to see how we can support them to access flexible financing, because we also realize that when care burdens are extended and exacerbated in that case, women and young people have less time to actually engage and interact within the mechanisms that are more formalized to be able to then get into processes of trying to access financing. We also ultimately believe that climate finance should contribute to, it can contribute to climate justice when there's a power shift. So questions of power come in. So it's not just a funding issue, but how we're able to sort of assist in positioning those most affected to lead with the solutions. So that's one way we are contributing to equitable financing mechanisms. And that's why we feel that they're really important in the bigger scheme of things. Thanks.
Yes, that's fantastic. I think a lot of what you mentioned there when you spoke about the access to resources and who gets the funding, as simple as it may sound, we know that there's funding out there, but is it reaching who's most affected? And I think that's a critical question that you really helped us to explore. Also, the idea of this funding having a more intentional focus on grassroots organizations and that informal sector that very often is made up of the majority of women and girls. So I think you can see the idea of intentionality. I really appreciate you mentioning. I also think, and it really resonates with me, the concept of the care burden, which in my society anyway, I won't speak for all, is extremely gendered. So you have a burden already as a woman or someone who is involved in that. But whenever there is a climate crisis or any kind of crisis, you are still expected to carry on with those duties that you have to do and carry that burden, as it were, literally and figuratively. So I do really appreciate your mention of the fact that that added stress, and there's also a strong mental and psychological stress associated with that. That really does negatively impact an ability to take part in more formal mechanisms of financing, and we appreciate you mentioning that. So I will leave you with one last question, and that question is, this webinar we have representatives from the Caribbean and the African continent, and you coming from the African continent. Are there any region-specific opportunities that you can identify that could improve access to climate finance for women?
So I think there's several opportunities that are beginning to emerge, and I think really there's this notion of collaboration, right? So being able to collaborate and leverage off of the different capabilities and different strengths that women-led organizations and entities, and by virtue of where they are located, bring to the space. What we're seeing more of is a shift towards collaboration. We're seeing a gaining momentum within the region, at least within the Southern Africa region, where we are working on collaborating. We're seeing more momentum growing around regional collaboration, and also this idea of pooled funding mechanisms, especially in this current context where global funding across the board to the development sector has drastically reduced. There's been a shift within the landscape. So what we're seeing more of is a lot more dialogue and engagement by organizations, by movements, trying to sort of explore the idea of pooled funding. And with that, I think we're seeing more conversations around it and exploration around how organizations can collaborate to be able to then leverage and reduce duplication, but also to, in recognizing that there are limited resources, we need to collaborate at some point, because at the end of the day, from one of the things that we have experienced quite often is that you have civil society actors working within a community, and as you go along, you realize that, we are working in the same space, engaging with the same communities, and so there is a duplication, and also the fact that there's an opportunity to leverage off of the intersectional approach, that also becomes a strength for civil society. That's also something that we're seeing also gaining momentum, and a growing recognition around communities not experiencing climate and life and some of these disasters in isolation. So communities don't just experience climate related issues. They don't just experience economic issues, but it's all, it's all interconnected, it's intersectional for them. And so as they're trying to sort of find solutions, they want solutions that are also holistic. And so by being able to collaborate and drive for that level of engagement and collaboration, I think that approach is something that we're seeing gaining more momentum. And even with the sort of engagement platforms that are emerging, they're really sort of taking a more intersectional approach. And that's really something that we're picking up on. And so that's a great opportunity that we're seeing emerge from the Southern Africa region. And more on the continent, the Southern Africa Trust is part of a group of organizations that work around climate justice. And this network of organizations really sort of came together last year to start exploring cross-learning and collaboration. And we came together in February in Kenya. And the idea was really to explore some of the learnings that are taking place. So the network is made up of organizations that are working in West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, and South America. So the idea was to see how we can leverage off of the opportunities that are there, and to be able to collaborate, bring our unique perspectives and experiences, because our engagement and our approach with these issues are multidimensional. You have organizations that are working on disability issues, trying to sort of center and bring to the fore the idea of how do you support and position people living with disabilities to be able to access financing, but also to bring out the issues and how they're impacted by climate change and shifts within the climate. We had organizations that work with children, so trying to sort of connect the dots. And we also have organizations that work with children that live with disabilities. So trying to sort of support families, because then it becomes an ecosystem issue. So there's really quite a broad range of actors in the network. So again, at a continent level, that's an opportunity that we also see emerging. And we hope that more and more of such networks will come together and coalesce around climate issues. And one of the things that we've come together around, we actually have a working group around it, is climate finance. So trying to sort of demystify it for those that don't have a full sense of what it is, and trying to sort of connect the resources for understanding and being able to share knowledge, but also to be able to look for opportunities that we can leverage off and be able to drive some of the interventions that we've planned. I think overall there are some examples that I can cite around how we can look at taking advantage of the opportunities that exist. So for instance, when you look at women working in agriculture and adaptation, right? That's a very sort of important area and very specific, in that across the region in Southern Africa, and I'm sure this would apply to other regions, women are already leading adaptation efforts in those spaces, and whether it's climate resilient farming or water management, there's an opportunity there to align climate finances with those existing practices, rather than trying to introduce new models. So how do you support the already recognized and the recognized and in use measures that women are using already and communities are using? How do you support them with climate financing, as opposed to, you know, coming up with completely new ideas that you then want to go and sell to people who are already adapting? Because while we sit in spaces like this, right, that communities don't always have access to and deliberate on policy issues. It could be even at CSW, there are all these deliberations. On the ground, people are adapting and people are moving. So while we're forming the policies and dialoguing and debating and trying to sort of summarize our reports and saying, look, this doesn't sound right. Have we used the right buzzwords? What's the new catchphrase? Or what are the buzzwords? People are adapting because for them, life is real. That's their reality. And so they are moving on. So yeah, they're not waiting. They're not waiting for anyone. And so we need to catch up and support what interventions they have, because they are living their reality, and we need to respect that, recognize that, and be able to see how we can support that, because they know, you know, there's this idea of indigenous knowledge as well that we tend to overlook. And I think that's something that needs to be recognized in how we support in models that, you know, support climate financing. So trying to rather align than come up with new things. And then there's this notion again of the informal economy. So in Southern Africa, like most of Africa, the informal community plays a huge role in the development in the development and sort of economic progress and economic dimensions. So the idea is that because the informal economy is such a big part of how we operate, right? It's a space that we can't shy away from engaging in, and there's a real opportunity there to support women and young people who are the majority of the people who are involved in the informal economy, looking at the kind of resource that they have access to. They wouldn't ordinarily have access to formalized systems. They don't have the financial track record and history that allows them to be able to gain access to financing in formal setups. They don't have collateral. They don't have the documentation that could support them to do that. So I think recognizing the role and their contribution to the economy, even if it's from the informal sector, and coming up with solutions that meet them where they are, I think is an opportunity. There's a real opportunity there for climate finance to better support the informal actors and informal and small-scale enterprises, especially in areas like clean energy, the circular economy solutions. We're seeing a lot of opportunities come up, especially with young people around circular economy sort of interventions. And there's very interesting stuff, very interesting innovations that we're seeing across the region. But again, it's that financing. We see a lot of interventions that are more geared towards positioning women and young people to sort of say, how do you access financing? But I think at the end of the day, we need to move a step further and actually begin to see more of these pockets, or at least grants, become available to actors in the space, not just leaving them with hope or this idea that you must formalize, open a bank account. This is how you do your paperwork. So laying the groundwork and then leaving it at that. But it needs to be holistic in its approach. So I think from our end, we're seeing an opportunity there to go beyond rhetoric and sort of move to practice by actually supporting real grant making, real financing opportunities for informal economy solutions. And lastly, I think, again, there's a lot of opportunity around being able to collaborate. So spaces like this where we're exchanging ideas. At the Trust, we pride ourselves in our convening power and our ability to bring together diverse groups of actors to be able to collaborate and dialogue and share ideas and experiences around how they're approaching intervention. So, for example, we've supported women-led organizations, movements, and young people to engage in key regional platforms like the Africa Climate Week, and spaces that look at the just transition that are often dominated by state and private sector. So you have conversations going on around the just transition and trying to sort of come up with energy trajectories and programming and directions that will impact on the same people that are excluded. So from our end, we believe that being able to support people on the front line to participate in the spaces really strengthens their visibility and influence in shaping both the agenda and sort of the idea and the process of how they can access climate financing. At the end of the day, we really believe that there is an opportunity not just to create new structures, but to resource and scale what is already working. So those are some of the opportunities that we see that really center around regional collaboration, supporting the informal economy, as well as supporting the current and successful adaptation and resilience measures. So, yeah, I
That's
hope I've
wonderful.
answered your question.
Yes, you definitely have and more. You've given us so much food for thought. And more important than that, you've planted such a seed of hope because I think from what you're saying, there are so many opportunities, and in every challenge lies an opportunity. So you really helped us to flesh out and see the opportunities that lie. And I loved that there was quite a lot of resonance with what you said in our first speaker who intervened and was talking about the experience of CSW in that collaboration is key. So the same silos that you referred to where we see, duplication of effort, that's why it's so important for us to collaborate and see how best can we amplify what's already happening. As you yourself mentioned, there's no need to reinvent the wheel or think that there must be some new project or new concept that's just going to be groundbreaking. As you said, we have to catch up with what's already happening because people are living their lives so that they can thrive and create some intergenerational economic resilience. So those, I think, were some really powerful sentiments. And I know, I mean, as you were talking, I was writing down notes. My hand is going to be quite tired by the end of this, but we really do appreciate your intervention. And I'll just give a note to our audience. If anyone has any questions for Aliness, please put them in the chat. Make sure you address them to her, and we'll try our best to get them answered during the Q&A. So at this point, I would love to introduce our next panelist. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Sasha Jattansingh, who will be exploring the topic of loss and damage, climate finance, and climate justice through a feminist lens. So Sasha is a climate finance and environmental policy expert with over 15 years of experience in the public sector, in international development, and in civil society sectors in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean at large. She's currently the Deputy Director and Senior Adaptation and Loss and Damage Expert at Climate Analytics Caribbean and has a strong background in environmental and climate policy, climate finance, civil society governance, capacity building, and scientific communication. Sasha also co-leads the Access to Finance Working Group of the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance and is a Senior Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity at the London School of Economics and Policy and Political Science, where her research interests are on climate justice, participatory environmental governance, and transformative change. Sasha holds a Master of Science in Environmental Policy and Regulation from the London School of Economics and Political Science, a Master's of Engineering in Environmental Engineering from the University of Auckland, and an Honours Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from the University of Toronto. And she's a Commonwealth Scholar alumnus. So welcome, Sasha. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Stacey. And, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I love the name of the webinar.
Yeah.
Rewiring Climate Systems, Women Redesigning Governance and Finance Across Africa and the Caribbean. I think it's just a really fantastic name. It's quite timely and quite relevant as well.
Yes. Well, I'm glad you could be here because for me, the question was, how could you not be in this conversation if we know what your work is? So thanks so much for being here. So I'll jump right into my first question, which looks at community, national, and regional levels as a hierarchy that we allocate climate finance to. Is there one of these that you consider the most important in funding allocation, or is there a ranking that you'd use to categorize these levels?
So, I mean, I understand where this question is
Mm-hmm.
going. But I think we have to go back to when you started this conversation, this webinar on what
Yes.
is climate justice. And that will really help to ground what is more important than what. And I think, when you started with saying that climate justice is really a moral and ethical challenge, and it really seeks to address the disproportionate impact of climate change on vulnerable communities and future generations. But it's looking at the fact that climate impacts are not distributed equally, and it disproportionately affects the most marginalized and disadvantaged peoples and communities. So, because of that, climate justice really now means that we have to consider the ethical and moral obligations of what climate action should entail. Because, looking at climate justice, it really identifies climate change as a symptom of unfair and unrepresentative economic, social, and political systems, right? Looking at historical and systemic inequalities and inequities, which, we've been discussing throughout this webinar. So when we're looking at what climate justice is, then that means that climate action really should prioritize the needs of those who are most affected by climate change, also, striving to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time ensure that the burdens and the benefits of climate action are distributed fairly. So all of that just to say, it's not about which level is more important, but really trying to understand how much climate finance is needed and where, and how is this climate finance allocated, right? And understanding that, when we look at climate finance and climate justice, there are different levels that this will play out at. You have the international level, regional, national, and then the community or local level. But really and truly, no one is more important than the other. But what is important is how each level links and intersects with each other to really build the case to advance the need for, fair and just climate finance that is accessible to the communities, regions, people that most need it to deal with the adverse impacts of climate change. So, that's what I think is quite important to understand. And at the international level, in order to, look at how climate finance is allocated and how much is needed and to whom, really and truly, climate finance to the most vulnerable countries and communities really should prioritize grants over loans. So prioritize grant funding and highly concessional funding over loans. I mean, you can't, we can't borrow our way out of any sort of climate disaster, right? And I think that is quite important to note that any sort of climate finance should be grant-based. And at the international level, the Alliance for Small Island States, as well as the group of least developed countries, these are the negotiating groups for the SIDS and LDCs. They've always been advocating for the need for grant-based finance over loans, just to ensure that, that we're not burdened by the unequal and oppressive financial systems that were never designed for us to, right? So we need to have equal footing in order to deal with the climate impacts that we did not cause, right? And what we're seeing at the international level, for the Green Climate Fund, for example, they've actually started to prioritize SIDS and LDCs. So the GCF now has a floor of 50% of adaptation funding that goes to SIDS and LDCs, right? And that's just one fund, but other climate finance funds should do the same. I would say another issue that speaks to how climate finance is allocated and to whom is looking at the eligibility criteria. So, what a lot of multilateral donors and bilateral donors tend to do is they look at GDP, gross domestic product, as an eligibility criteria. But that is very archaic, and it does not actually consider climate vulnerability, right? And for countries in the Caribbean, we tend to be middle or high middle income countries, just by the fact that things cost more in the Caribbean, right? But that does not mean that we are doing great economically and on par with other countries. And it does not speak to the fact that we are in one of the most climate risky zones. So we have to also consider looking at other sort of eligibility criteria that will make how climate finance is allocated to countries and regions fairer as well. And that's from the international levels, things to consider. At the regional level, what is quite important is, sharing knowledge and expertise to help countries within the region and across regions as well to be able to access climate finance and develop what is a suite of, financial instruments that works. So, South-South knowledge exchanges, pair exchanges and so on, what works and what can we implement, what can we adapt, what can we scale up that's homegrown, that's really focused on the needs and priorities of developing countries and communities. And then, when we're thinking of the national level, we have to consider who is the most vulnerable, where are they located, and what inequalities exist that make these groups and communities more vulnerable to climate change. And understanding that will really help to strengthen the national response, regional response, and then how we advocate for fair allocation of climate finance at the international level. And over the last year, I actually co-developed a draft participatory methodology and toolkit to assess loss and damage in Caribbean communities. It's still being piloted and finalized. So if any group, civil society organization or community is interested in helping to test and pilot it, you're very much welcome to engage on it. And this toolkit really looks at what are the existing social, economic, and historical inequalities that make communities more vulnerable to climate impacts. So really understanding why are they vulnerable to climate change in the first place? And why do some, why is it that they are they're impacted more than other communities, right? And then at the same time, have the communities co-develop solutions which tackle inequalities as well as building climate resilience. So it's really a bottom-up approach that we utilize. And I think that's quite important because now you have communities co-leading this process, and these are the solutions that will help us to be climate resilient and to share that with governments and so on in order to ensure that any sort of climate action actually is beneficial to the most vulnerable communities. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I think one of the things that one of the big takeaways I'll take from this session is your comment that it's not a matter of allocating a place for either national or community or regional. It's really seeing how do they interconnect with each other. And we keep coming back to this idea of intersectional collaboration as well as the idea of how important it is to co-develop any mechanisms. And also what really hit home for me, the idea of these eligibility criteria. And often the things that make us ineligible are the very reasons we need the help and we need the more grant-based help as opposed to loans, which can definitely just reinforce some structures that are archaic and don't really serve us any good. So I really love that exploration. Thank you for that. So I'll move into the next question about loss and damage, which is your specialty area. How can a feminist approach to loss and damage address some of the inequalities you mentioned before?
Mm-hmm. So So, I mean, I'll be very honest. I didn't, I didn't know what a feminist approach to climate finance was. And when I started reading it, I'm like, a lot of the work that I do already actually incorporates, these principles. And a lot of the advocacy on loss and damage finance at the international level incorporates this feminist approach. It may not be called that, but I think it's important to name it and understand why this is important. And looking at a feminist approach to climate finance, it really looks at how funds are raised and distributed, and it focuses on equity, justice, and direct support to the most vulnerable, including women and marginalized groups. And looking at, prioritizing grant-based funding over loans, right? Looking at participatory governance, and really merges climate action with gender equality, right? And making sure that resources are directed to more community level actions, and tackling systemic change and enabling social protection, right? And all of that together will really help build climate resilience in the long term, right? And what's quite important with that is that you want to ensure that the loss and damage finance is direct and accessible. It reaches the communities and the organizations and the people that need this the most. And it moves away from, more bureaucratic and inaccessible structures, right? You really want to unlock like the loss and damage finance for the most vulnerable. And then also, of course, and I will say this over and over, the need for grants over loans, because you want to ensure that you have non-debt creating financial instruments, right? Because you don't want to worsen the financial burdens on, developing countries like SIDS and LDCs, and also, women, farmers, fishers, and so on, who are already, very much impacted by climate change, if it's due to hurricane or flooding and so on. And I think we had a nice discussion understanding what are the sorts of impacts that women and marginalized groups face on top of all the other things they have to deal with. And then also, the feminist approach to climate finance really looks at intersectionality, which I think is the link, the thread that goes through everything, on trying to understand how climate finance should be allocated, how loss and damage finance should be, should be considered when you want to address inequality and so on. And then also looking at how can we tackle systemic inequality? How can we challenge, the current uneven power systems at play? How do we challenge the existing, economic systems that are very, extractivist driven, right? That more, and shift to economy that, prioritizes environmental health and human well-being, right? How do we shift that? Actually, very recently, I think in December 2025, Climate Analytics Caribbean, myself and Priya Mohan at the University of the West Indies, at St. Augustine, we actually co-authored a report called Loss and Damage Financing and Debt Sustainability, Justice and Equity Considerations in the Caribbean, which really did consider a feminist approach to loss and damage financing. And what we did is we proposed what a Caribbean definition of loss and damage would be, which draws upon, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change framing of loss and damage, but it also builds upon the 3 Ps framework developed by the IIED. And what it showed is that loss and damage in the Caribbean is really a function of three Ps. So the first P is predisposing factors. That's the existing vulnerabilities. So, our geographic and environmental factors, the fact that we're small size, we have dispersed population, most of our population is on the coast, we're generally removed from major markets. But then also looking at like the economic factors, the fact that, we tend to be highly dependent on climate sensitive sectors like tourism, fisheries, agriculture. But then also we have high debt burdens. Then we also looked at the socio-political and historical factors, colonialism and its legacies, previous loss and damage, and the cumulative burdens that causes, and looking at, safety and security issues and power asymmetries, but then also looking at livelihoods and social inequalities. So looking at income and livelihood insecurity and so forth. And the fact that, a large portion of our population in the Caribbean tend to be largely belong to the informal sector, and they also tend to be largely unbanked, right? But then from the disposing factors, another factor is the precipitating factors, and those are the triggering climate events. So the fact that we have, increased extreme weather events like hurricanes and floodings, as well as slow onset events, sea level rise. The fact that now it's not only these one-off events, but we tend to have compound and cascading events that actually make the climate impacts a lot worse. And then the fact that we now have climate-induced health hazards that we have to deal with. So, the climate-induced health impacts of hot spells and heat waves, for example. And lastly, the third factor is the protective factor. So what are the existing capacities and measures in the Caribbean that actually make us resilient, right? And this is something we tend to forget about, but the fact that what are the existing infrastructure and resilience measures, the fact that, we have early warning systems in place, we have nature-based solutions, we have community and local governance systems and so on already that actually helps with emergency response and so on. We also do have existing financial protection mechanisms like social safety nets, risk transfer mechanisms like the CRIF, the parametric insurance facility, and then regional cooperation and advocacy through CARICOM and the OECS and so on. And then lastly, another important protective factor is the importance of community and adaptive capacity. So, our existing social capital and social cohesion networks that we have for us to deal with disasters and so on already. And I think that gives a more holistic understanding of loss and damage in the Caribbean, right? Which I think is quite important. And from that, understanding what loss and damage is in the Caribbean, we could look at how can any sort of loss and damage financing and loss and damage financing instruments could address inequality. And two recommendations from the report was that, we should consider utilizing traditional and indigenous financing systems, within the Caribbean. So, looking at how can we formalize these sorts of community financing and indigenous financing models. So, the SUSU model, which is also called Boxhand and so on. So that is, indigenous peer-to-peer financing, and it's built on mutual trust. And then also, we have a legacy of credit unions and cooperatives in the Caribbean. And that, utilizing these sorts of models could really help us create these sort of financially inclusive and accessible tools to help bolster community resilience against shocks. So how can we use existing mechanisms to help to enable loss and damage finance to reach communities, right? Instead of trying to implement something from the global north. And then the other recommendation was really to look at any sort of loss and damage financing, innovative financing mechanism really needed to consider equity, justice, and human rights. So, the need we had to look at smart and intentional disbursement. So consult with communities and affected groups to determine what were the best disbursement methods locally, So in discussion, when we were doing this report, from Jamaica, one CSO had said that, when Hurricane Beryl had hit, instead of giving direct cash transfers to, let's say, the affected communities, and which would have mostly gone to the men, women actually said, no, we didn't want that. What we wanted is food cards and to go to the village shop and we're able to access and get the food supplies we needed. We didn't need the cash, but we needed the food, right? And that works, and that actually worked. And then the other recommendation was, removing these barriers to accessing finance. So the fact that we have such a high unbanked population in the Caribbean, yet a lot of the financial instruments, the grants and so on, requires bank accounts. And then also you need to, also they need a lot of legal requirements. You need to show that you have land tenure. You need to have like a farmer's badge and so forth. And then also you need to go to the capital in order to complete the forms and so forth. So if we truly want this to be fair and just and accessible, we need to actually, actually walk the talk and create these sort of systems that is really accessible. Do we really need a bank account for people to access these grants? Is there any other method? Do they really need land tenure and a farmer's badge? Okay, or is there something else? And can't we go into the communities and help them fill out the forms to access the grants, and so forth for addressing loss and damage impacts? So these are some recommendations put forward by the report, and there were a lot others, but I think it was quite important to show the importance of incorporating community and voices in the design and implementation of any sort of loss and damage finance mechanism, to ensure that we address any sort of underlying inequalities and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I think, again, I see so many connections between what you're saying and you coming from the region of the Caribbean, and we had Aliness from the African continent. You can see that whole idea of what makes us eligible, that vulnerability that should be at the heart of the moral and ethical underpinning of climate finance. We tend to forget those things, and that everything must be human rights based. So I really appreciated your intervention. And I mean, our discussion could go on. I mean, but for the interest of time, I'd like to give our next
Sure.
panelist. Thanks so much for your insights. And I also want to be able to interact with our audience to consider some questions. So we're going to go to our next panelist. Thanks so much for joining us, Pietari. We're going to ask you one question, again, in the interest of time, because we know that we do have some interest from interesting audience questions. So our final speaker of the day is Pietari Arikka, who is going to be looking at women's leadership in community-based adaptation and sector governance. He is a development advisor, and he also works in programs to improve equitable access to water, sanitation, and hygiene services across multiple regions of Ethiopia, with a strong emphasis on gender equality, disability inclusion, and women's meaningful participation. He has extensive experience in international development and project management, ranging from local communities to high levels at UNAIDS and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland and the Embassy of Finland in Namibia. And his background covers the themes of gender equality and women empowerment and gender-based violence, climate adaptation, and the circular economy. So welcome, Pietari. Thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you so much.
You're welcome.
Stacey.
So I will jump into the question for you, which looks at, if we take a look at the way there's a rollback of scientific and regulatory safeguards and funding streams that are based in the global north, we mentioned challenges being reframed. How do you think these challenges can be reframed as opportunities when it comes to community-based adaptation?
Okay, thank you, Stacey, for the question, and thank you for the invitation. It's such a great honor to be part of this really interesting discussion. I've been just holding my breath the whole 90 minutes and listening for all the fantastic speakers. It's been really fruitful discussions, and it's been such a pleasure just to listen and compare my experiences to other panelists and other keynote speaker, and you, of course, Stacey. So thank you. Thank you. Going back to your question, as we all know, development sector and humanitarian aid is going through rapid and existential change. And also referring to Ms. Frita's opening remarks, I think that was a really cross-cutting theme throughout CSW, that we are going through huge change, and in many levels when it comes to women leadership and empowerment and gender discussion, as well as climate discussion. The improvement, it's not we can't take it for granted anymore, unfortunately, and in many ways we're actually going backwards. So being said that, we don't need to go into the details with that, because we all are aware that things are changing politically, economically, and the values are also changing, unfortunately, not always in the better way. So how I see when it comes to funding mechanisms and development work, the method is changing for sure. And but that can also be opening. I feel that we need more support and on gender equality and climate action more than ever. But what is changing is how we work, how we should work, who will define the priorities, and how I see it is how the power and responsibility are distributed in the future. So the crisis can also be opportunity to reframe the whole governance. That's what I'm hoping. I don't know, because we still need to be hopeful, because sometimes looking the news nowadays is not too optimistic. But we'll try to be optimistic. There's always, when there's a will, there's a way. And I think reframing the governance, we have to do it by pushing away from the dependency, the traditional development work, from global north funding, global south, really project orientated or time frame orientated individual projects, and we have to go towards more local governance systems. We have to be, before reframing the governance, I think we need to ask ourselves on the planning phase that who is leading the future development work, who is the accountable side of it, and whose knowledge counts, because we don't want to repeat the traditional strategy that usually global north actors or headquarters are giving the templates to, let's say, African context, and then we or whoever are the beneficiaries have tried to implement them. So, and for the background, yes, I'm at the moment working in Ethiopia as a development advisor, and this being said, we can use examples from the COWASH that we've been busy with lately. So just a couple words, trying to be brief. I see the time. I don't have too much time, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. But COWASH is a bilateral project between Finland and Ethiopia, and the history goes all the way back 15 years ago, and we have more than 5 million beneficiaries. Basic idea is that we're building water points, and cross-cutting theme with all our activities go through women empowerment and inclusion, including menstrual hygiene and economic empowerment. But we're working in 8 different regions, and Ethiopia is a diverse country. All the regions are really different, and now with the political environment and different security challenges. What makes COWASH unique, or maybe not unique, but so successful, even though the context it's sometimes challenging, is that we are using community managed project approach, so CMP approach, where the communities itself, they are taking care of the planning, implementation, maintaining, leading the project. So basically us, even though it's a bilateral project, funding is coming from Finland, Ethiopian governments, but with the context that we are now in, there's many areas, many regions that we can't access. And what is surprising us positively is that even though the governments are not there, or federal teams are not there, actually the results are really good when we give the communities themselves the power to plan, to implement, maintain all the activities, from trainings to building the water points, to building menstrual hygiene management centers. And that really shows that if we start from, we're always talking about bottom up approach, but we fail to actually do that in many ways. I'm not blaming anyone, but now when we are going this existential change of development sector, we have to find the different ways that if we are not getting the funding from Global North, or if we are not getting the experts from neighboring countries, or regional support, the development and the support still has to take place. So that's why I'm seeing that in Ethiopia, the COWASH project that we are working with, that's a good example of possible future approach, how to work without that global North support, expertise wise or funding wise. And then to add one more point, is what Alina said well, is that she was saying that in Zambia and Southern Africa, there's more and more regional cooperation and parallel systems, even though if the topics are a bit, because there's synergies always. If one project is focusing on water, one is for job creation, one is for education, there's always synergies. Or if the target is even the same theme, if let's say UN and local NGOs are working on the same themes and the same goals, but in parallel systems. And that's what we've been also busy now lately, because we don't know what future brings. We don't know how the funding tools, for sure they are changing, but we are trying to push that COWASH would see future phases also. So contacting other similar actors, local actors, NGOs, or international or regional actors with the same aim, with the same tools. I think working with them, trying to avoid parallel systems and instead adding them and working together. I think those are the positive sides of having this kind of crisis on funding, that we actually have to use smarter our resources and shared ownership, and we need stronger sector governance. We are always talking about it, but how to actually start and implement that from the bottom, from hearing the local communities. And I think they have to be part of them from the beginning and from the planning and to be able to change the mindsets and the tools. I think one good thing is that the funding methods are changing, which push us to change. Okay, we are going a bit over time. So just to conclude, I think the change is deeply concerning for sure. We are facing a transition. There's limited funds, tools. I think the power relations are changing, and there's no going back. But is the bad thing entirely or good thing? I think again, the synergies. I don't have time to talk about it now. It's not that black and white. But I'd say that we have to focus on community-based governance, regional and national and community cooperation, rather than parallel systems. And I think this moment can actually move us closer to actual climate justice rather than further away. That's it. Thank you.
Oh, but thank you so much. So much of what you said resonated. So, I mean, I think it sounds as if we might need to have a part two of this webinar. Can this be a webinar series? But I think those points you raised about the fact that often these power structures very much need to shift, and that there's almost a level of fiscal colonialism if we look at this constant idea of getting global funding from the global north, which tends to be in the form of loans as opposed to grants. And I also think it was incredibly inspiring what you mentioned, that once you trust communities to co-develop solutions and to lead in the implementation of those solutions, it turns out to be exactly what the community needs. So those are the kind of things that, and the kind of examples that we want to keep amplifying. So I'm going to look to wrap up now. I see there were two questions in the chat that were actually answered by the panel discussants. One was directed towards Frita and mentioned the idea of how to amplify the work of those who are marginalized, and that we have to look at, and Frita's answer to that was, we can't just see the private sector as a source of funding. We have to look at the everyday realities. And I think all our panelists very eloquently spoke to that. And the idea of collaboration being not just working together, but holding each other accountable. That was crucial. The question for Sasha in the chat mentioned the idea of business education along with funding. And Sasha shared her report in the chat, but also mentioned that creating the idea of business funding or business education is an important consideration in grants. So to improve impact and capacity building, we have to think about that. Well, I don't want us ever to run out of time, but I think we can draw the session to a close today. And an incredible thank you to our speakers, to Sasha, to Pietari, to Aliness. You have really brought an idea of a synergy, and we come from different regions, but we can see the collective core of what we all want. It's the same. So that's a message that's always going to stay with me. If there are any questions that anyone has, we can always send these to our speakers after the fact, and we'll keep in touch with them. Please just reach out to us. Thank you all so much for today. I wish all webinars could be like this, but thank you so much. I've learned so much as usual. So thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.